Thank you for joining us for the webinar, Wildlife Management as a Bacteria Management Measure in New Braunfels, Texas. My name is Elena Berg, and I am a planner with the Environment and Development Department of the North Central Texas Council of Governments, or NCT-COG. To give a brief overview of who we are, NCT-COG is a voluntary association of local governments. We are one of 24 COGs in Texas, and our main function is to transcend jurisdictional boundaries to promote sound development and facilitate cooperation among our member governments. As part of our water quality management planning work, we host workshops and/or webinars on water quality topics. If you have any ideas for future topics for these workshops and webinars, please feel free to send them to me. I'd appreciate hearing them. My email address is shown on the screen. Our main presentation today is from Mark Enders, Watershed Program Manager with the City of New Braunfels. Thank you, Mark, for presenting today. Mr. Enders graduated from Texas State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science with an emphasis in water policy and river management. After graduating, Mark began working with a water quality testing laboratory in Austin. Mark continued his professional career in the Lake Tahoe area, performing watershed management and water quality monitoring duties with an environmental consulting firm, Integrated Environmental Restoration Services. Mark moved back to Central Texas in 2011, where he continued to work in the field of water quality management with the San Antonio water system. Overall, Mark has more than 13 years of experience working to protect surface water quality. And Mark, at this time, I will turn it over to you.
Good deal, and thank you, Elena, for the introduction. As Elena mentioned, my name is Mark Enders, and I'm the Watershed Program Manager for the City of New Braunfels. I've been with the city for about 6 years here, working on watershed management initiatives. My main roles at the city are to oversee the city's MS4 stormwater program and permit requirements, also a habitat conservation plan that's aimed at protecting endangered species in the Comal River system, and then also working on a watershed protection plan to address bacteria levels in the dry Comal Creek and Comal rivers here in New Braunfels. And so that watershed protection planning effort is kind of what I'll focus on today. Just to get started, a quick background about the City of New Braunfels. The City of New Braunfels is located almost right in between the city of San Antonio and Austin, right on the I-35 corridor. We've been seeing rapid population growth in New Braunfels. Going back to the 2010 census, we were a town of 50,000. Right now, our unofficial population is closer to 80,000. So considerable growth, as I assume, North Texas, all over Texas is experiencing. We have two major rivers that flow through the City of New Braunfels. Those are the Comal River, which is spring-fed by the Comal Springs that issue from the Edwards Aquifer. And then we also have the Guadalupe River that flows through town that starts up near Comfort, flows through New Braunfels on its way to the Gulf of Mexico. Those two rivers support a large tourism industry here in New Braunfels. So we have tens of thousands of folks that come to New Braunfels every summer just to tube, to visit Schlitterbahn and other water recreational businesses. So, again, a big tourism economy here in New Braunfels. So with that, I'll kind of dive in. On the screen here, it just shows the water quality monitoring stations that our river authority, the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, they come out on a monthly basis and collect water samples at these locations on the Dry Comal Creek, the Comal River, and the Guadalupe River. And they've been doing that monitoring since the 90s, and so have a large data set for a handful of different water quality parameters for each of these stream segments. So based on that monitoring, bacteria is one of the parameters that they sample for and test for in the lab. The Dry Comal Creek, which is a small creek that doesn't exhibit a lot of stream flow, typically it's between 1 and 5 cubic feet per second, but it is a tributary to the Comal River. It has a large drainage area, but again, as the name implies, there's not a lot of flow in that river or in that creek. And there's not any recreation activity that goes on Dry Comal Creek. It's largely surrounded by private property. There's no proper swimming holes as it's not deep enough. But anyhow, that based on the testing that's done regularly by the River Authority, that water body was placed on the state's 303D listing for impaired for bacteria. Also, the Comal River, which accepts, flow from the dry Comal Creek, we had, going back to 2008, 2010, we had seen increasing bacteria levels on the Comal River, and I just pulled up on the screen the slide showing the bacteria levels on both of the water bodies. So as it stands today, and as of the latest issuance of the 303D list by the state, both the dry Comal Creek and the Comal River are listed on the impaired water body listing for bacteria. And of course, the city has concern, as again, I mentioned that we have a large tourism economy, so we wanted to basically do everything that we can to try to address these bacteria levels on the dry Comal Creek and the Comal River. One of the first things that we did, of course, when we knew that we had bacteria levels that were exceeding the state standards, we wanted to try to determine where the bacteria was coming from. So we worked with Texas A&M Laboratory, Dr. Terry Gentry, with Texas A&M AgriLife to perform a bacteria source tracking, or BST, analysis on both the dry Comal Creek and the Comal River. So we worked with Texas A&M to do that analysis in 2013 and 2016. So the pie charts that I have on the screen here show the distribution of where the bacteria sources were coming from. As you can see, 60 to 70% of the bacteria found in the waterway when we did the testing came from wildlife. So they have a split between avian wildlife, which would be your ducks and your geese and your waterfowl, and then also non-avian wildlife, which would be, white-tailed deer, raccoons, foxes, any kind of other, normal wildlife that you would see. So the bacteria source tracking, it is kind of the best available science for determining source of bacteria. While I'm not 100% confident in these results, it does provide us, at least for a snapshot in time, on when these BST samples were taken, on what the sources of bacteria were. And I think and I'll talk a little bit later about how we move forward with a wildlife feeding ordinance, but just having this data on hand when you start going out to the public and talking to city council about decisions that need to be made about controlling bacteria inputs to the river, I think these bacteria source tracking results are very important when you're starting to work with the community on the sources. So, going back to 2013, 2014, when the dry Comal Creek was put on the 303D list and the Comal River bacteria levels were increasing, we reached out to TCEQ and applied for non-point source 319 grants. And so we were awarded funding back in 2014 and 15 to basically develop a watershed protection plan, which is really the state's preferred method of dealing with water quality issues for surface water. So we got that grant and then moved forward with development of a watershed protection plan to help address bacteria levels. Now that we have that watershed protection plan completed, it's been accepted by TCEQ and the EPA. Now that we have that completed and approved, we reached out back to TCEQ to get an implementation grant to begin implementing those bacteria measures that were included in the watershed protection plan. And you can kind of see the level of funding on the slide I have of the grant funding that we received. So right now we got about $450,000 from the state and through EPA to implement our watershed protection plan. The watershed protection plan has, several different, 5 different areas or categories, for bacteria management measures. So again, going back to those bacteria source tracking results, we knew that wildlife was a main contributor, so we definitely focused on making sure that we were including measures in the plan associated with overabundant urban wildlife. Aside from the bacteria source tracking analysis, it was pretty obvious, that there was overabundant urban wildlife populations within the city. We have, being right on the edge of the hill country, we have pretty significant populations of white-tailed deer, which was exacerbated by, routine feeding in a lot of rural neighborhoods, or even neighborhoods residential areas within the heart of the city, just even going right outside of downtown. It's not uncommon to see white-tailed deer running on major streets and real close to the downtown area in New Braunfels. So we knew there were overpopulations of white-tailed deer also in a couple of our city parks along the Comal River, namely Landa Park. You have a long history of folks and visitors coming down to the park solely to feed ducks and geese in the park. And so when you go down to the park, you see that feeding and you see really significant, overpopulations of those ducks and geese. And you can also see the waste excrement that's left behind by those ducks and geese, on walkways throughout the park. So again, with the Watershed Protection Plan, we included a measure to do a wildlife feeding ordinance, which was supported with Texas Parks and Wildlife input, and I'll talk a little more about that. And then we also have included in the Watershed Protection Plan some more active management measures for managing populations of deer and waterfowl in the city. And I'll focus on that here in a little bit. But we also include in the Watershed Protection Plan pet waste BMPs, which are, installing pet waste dispensers and then educating folks on proper management of pet waste. The Dry Comal Creek watershed extends out into rural areas outside of the city limits. And so you do have small livestock operations. There's no concentrated feeding lots, no significant livestock operations, but there are ranches that do, raise cattle, goats, and sheep. And so we have included in the plan, working with those ranchers and landowners to develop water quality management plans to kind of help implement bacteria management measures on those ranches. We also have included in the Watershed Protection Plan measures to address septic systems and largely within the county outside of the city limits. While there are some septic systems in the city limits, a lot of those have been connected into the sanitary sewer system. Going out into the rural areas, unincorporated areas in the county, we still have a large amount of septic systems. We did an analysis, and I forget the exact number, but it was close to 2,000 septic systems that were just within the watershed area of the Dry Comal Creek out in the county. And then we also had a focus on education and outreach. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through my presentation. I guess the important thing with the Watershed Protection Plan and these BMPs is that we assembled a stakeholder group of about 30 local stakeholders that represented different interests. And so we had a series of meetings during the development of this Watershed Protection Plan to solicit input from those stakeholders as well as technical advisors. So I think that's real important. It's actually a requirement of the grant that we got, but making sure that you have stakeholder buy-in and getting input from different interests and different stakeholders. Aside from that, we had all the technical advisors that we needed at the table, we felt. So this was Texas Parks and Wildlife, our River Authority, Guadalupe Blanco River Authority. We had Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and our local utility were all at the table, as well as Texas A&M AgriLife at the table as well. So they all gave input to help guide the selection of these bacteria management measures. Once we had developed the Watershed Protection Plan, we knew that we needed to kind of go out to the community to start talking about implementation of these bacteria management measures. Solely, I'm going to kind of more focus on just the urban wildlife management part of the Watershed Protection Plan. But we knew, in the plan we had included, doing a wildlife feeding ordinance and then also actively managing deer and duck populations. So we work very closely with Texas Parks and Wildlife. They actually have an urban biologist named Jessica Alderson that works out of the San Antonio office. So we teamed up very closely with her, and she was also involved during the development of the Watershed Protection Plan. But what we did is we arranged a series of public workshops as well as workshops solely for our city council to kind of explain these water quality issues and explain the negative impacts of overabundant urban wildlife within our community. And so it was very important to have Texas Parks and Wildlife at the table as kind of the expert on this matter. Texas Parks and Wildlife will remind you that they cannot make any decisions for the city as far as implementing feeding ordinances or doing any kind of management. They can only act as an advisor. But it's up to the local jurisdiction to kind of implement rules, regulations, ordinances on this type of thing. So as we went out to the community again, we had, I think it was 3 open public workshops that were open to the community, and we advertised those workshops through the local newspaper and did press releases to get the word out about those workshops. And then again, we also had a public workshop or a city council workshop that was also able to be attended to by the public. So each time that we had a public meeting, we focused on, overabundant urban wildlife and talked about the negative impacts of overabundant urban wildlife. So we decided not just to focus on water quality concerns, we also wanted to focus on safety concerns like deer and auto collisions. And so on the screen here, you can see the number of deer auto collisions that we had been tracking since 2015. So basically our animal control services here at the city, when they get a report or go out to remove a deer carcass from the side of one of the city roadways, they track that data. And so we were also able to, convey to the public how overabundant deer populations can cause a traffic and a safety concern. And we have, anywhere from 500 to 650 auto deer collisions each year. We also worked with Parks and Wildlife to talk about wildlife health in itself. And, Texas Parks and Wildlife was able to convey to the public that these overabundant populations and overpopulations of deer and ducks is actually unhealthy for the wildlife themselves. And so it's these were the main platforms that we used, the main concerns that we used as we moved through the public process. Again, I mentioned we had a series of public meetings regarding urban wildlife, and definitely in the city we had people that were split. We had folks, when we started talking about a wildlife feeding ordinance, there were folks that felt really strongly for and against it. There were folks that live in neighborhoods where they have always fed the deer and they like having those close-up encounters with the deer. Folks have deer feeders in their yard, go out to Land Park, and they take their kids and grandkids down to the park and they feed the wildlife as kind of a hobby. And so those folks came out in very staunch, opposition against the feeding ordinance and any kind of wildlife management. We also had folks that felt like the city needed to take a strong stance on, managing wildlife because they were seeing a lot of landscape damage to their plants. They had deer sleeping in their yards every night, defecating in their yards, cutting trails through the yards, causing traffic accidents, causing water quality issues. So we had folks that were also wanted the city to be really aggressive in their wildlife management strategies. So we had those public meetings, which were very important to let people voice their concerns. And then again, having Texas Parks and Wildlife there to help co-present with the city on, what is a typical population in an urban area? What are the negative impacts of overpopulations? What are the health impacts of overpopulation on the animals themselves? We also did community surveys that we launched an online survey that was sent out to throughout the city. And we also did at those public meetings, we used an active survey tool called Turning Point, where folks were asked a question and they could actually, put down their answer, and those would be electronically tallied up and shown on a display screen. So when you have a public meeting, folks can actually see the distribution of, what people's thoughts are, given a certain question. For instance, do you feel like the city should move forward with a wildlife feeding ordinance? And then, the 100 people in the room could submit their results, and then people could see what the other people in the room were thinking on that issue. So I think that was a very effective tool. Again, we also did council workshops. We did several council workshops to inform them of all the negative impacts of overabundant urban wildlife, inform them of the water quality issues and the water quality impairments, just to make sure that council had a good understanding on what we were doing or what we were wanting to do at that point. Again, worked very closely with our public information officer and the local newspaper to put out information about the watershed protection plan, about the water quality impairments, so folks could start getting the message on why the city might be moving forward with some of these different wildlife management initiatives. After we finished a lot of those public campaigns, we went to city council and, again, drafted a wildlife feeding ordinance that we had Texas Parks and Wildlife help us draft. Went to city council with that ordinance and actually got it passed through city council in September of 2018. The ordinance actually came into effect in March 10th of 2019, so we built a 6-month grace period so that we could do some more education and put up signage before the ordinance actually went into effect. So that ordinance prohibited the feeding of wildlife anywhere in the city, whether it's on public city property, at a city park, or whether that's, feeding deer in your backyard. So it applied to basically the entire city. The way the ordinance is written, we put the first offense as just a warning. So the intent of this is just to, we didn't want to pass an ordinance where folks were getting slapped with fines. A lot of times, especially in the city parks, this was, a grandmother maybe taking her grandchildren out to feed ducks. And so we didn't want to slap folks with fines. We wanted to have a first offense as a warning and then an opportunity to inform them of the negative impacts of wildlife feeding and overabundant wildlife. The ordinance does include fines from $75 to $500 for second offense. And it does allow folks to hang common bird feeders to feed birds as long as they're, 5 feet above the ground, to where it would be unable to be reached by deer or other animals. As far as the enforcement of the feeding ordinance, it's largely our park rangers that enforce the ordinance within city parks, and then our animal control and code compliance division that enforces the ordinance out in residential areas and throughout the city. Using grant funding that we had through our WPP implementation grant, we developed signage, largely which was put up in Land Park and some of our other parks where wildlife feeding was prominent. So you can see here on this slide just some examples of the signage that we installed. So we had bigger signs that were installed that had more of a message, some information. That would be kind of the sign on the right. And then we also had small signs that, like the one in the middle that was 3 inches by 5 inches, that basically we put down on picnic tables all throughout the park, just kind of to have something prominent throughout the park that would remind folks not to feed. And those signs are not the larger signs. You don't want to oversign a park and put large signs everywhere. It just detracts from the natural beauty of the park. So we were able to use these smaller signs and put those kind of on top of picnic tables where they weren't obstructing views and those types of things. But again, we're prominent because we put them on almost every picnic table. Aside from the wildlife feeding ordinance, the city also moved forward with doing trapping of non-native waterfowl in Land Park. So I think at one time we did some informal surveys throughout Land Park, and at one time, one survey period, we would count upwards of 200 ducks or geese within the park at one time. A large percentage of these ducks and geese were non-native. So largely Egyptian geese, which I understand are a problem throughout Texas, but also Florida and California. So I know they're a very invasive species of geese. Their ability to reproduce is very quickly and very strong. So they'll have several clutches throughout the year. The Egyptian geese and Muscovy ducks, the non-native ducks and geese, were a large part of the population of waterfowl within the park. So again, work very closely with Parks and Wildlife to move forward with the trapping, but we hired a contractor, Cherokee Capturing Service, to set up basically big box traps within the park that we feed ahead of time, and then the traps are automated to where we will feed in the trap, the ducks will come in, and then we'll close the doors, and they're able to grab them out, put them in large tote boxes, and actually relocate the Egyptian geese. So the Egyptian geese can be relocated, and the city did have those relocated. The Muscovy ducks, there's a federal law in place that prohibits from trapping and relocating that species of duck, just because they have been known to cause overpopulation and habitat disruptions wherever they're relocated. So there's a federal law against transporting the Muscovy ducks. But we've been, this is our second year of trapping. We typically do the trapping in the winter months when there's not as much visitor traffic in the park. And we typically do that trapping early morning, again, when there's not a whole lot of traffic in the park. We're trying not to set alarm and trying not to advertise what we're doing, but all the same, we have done a lot of education ahead of time so that folks in town know that we're doing this, that our city council knows we're doing this, and understands why we're doing the trapping. And then while the trapping is going on, city staff is always there to talk to park visitors about why we're doing the trapping. So I think when folks initially see it, they're very curious, but when you inform them of the water quality issues and some of the other issues of why they're overpopulated, they kind of have a better understanding. We also, through and the trapping of the waterfowl is we were not able to fund that through the watershed protection plan that we have. There were certain requirements of the funding that basically said that you could not, use the 319 non-point source pollution funding to do trapping. So that was something that the city had to find budget to do. But as you can see in the picture on the slide here, you can see the Egyptian geese along the waterfront, and you can see their excrement all over that walkway there. And so that was a pretty common occurrence and sight in Landa Park. To date, we've trapped upwards of 125 non-native waterfowl. And again, 8 trapping events in 2019, and we've completed 3 this year in 2020. We also have funded through the Watershed Protection Plan coding of non-native waterfowl eggs. And so what this does is you basically go and you locate eggs of non-native duck species, and we work with a contractor and a biologist to do this work so that we can make sure that we are only treating non-native waterfowl eggs. You go and you paint those eggs with basically just corn oil. Basically, that corn oil painted on the eggs suffocates the eggs and doesn't allow them to hatch, which kind of helps us to control the populations within the park and within the community. The reason that you coat those eggs rather than just to take them or crush the eggs is that if the duck or geese or goose still sees those eggs that are visible, they will not go out and try to lay more eggs or as many more eggs. So, again, if you take those eggs away, more rapidly put out new eggs. If you coat those with corn oil, then they will still think that's a viable clutch of eggs, and they will continue to tend to those and lay less eggs elsewhere. We've also been doing a lot with, public education outreach about the ordinance and the negative impacts of wildlife feeding. So we've developed several handouts and flyers that we can hand out at community events, but also, door hangers that we can hang on folks' doors if they are caught feeding. I mentioned that first offense is a warning with education. So if we catch someone feeding at their home in their backyard and we get a report of that, we can put an informational door hanger on their door. If we're in the park and our park rangers catch somebody feeding wildlife in the park, they can, stop them, inform them of the ordinance, and then give them a postcard handout that talks about the ordinance and why it's harmful to feed wildlife. And then again, we continue to do wildlife management workshops with Parks and Wildlife. I mentioned that we did a lot of these workshops ahead of the implementation of the wildlife feeding ordinance, but we will continue to work with Parks and Wildlife as folks kind of learn about the ordinance. We can continue to educate them on the negative impacts of wildlife feeding. Also with education outreach, and part of the Watershed Protection Plan, we put a lot of emphasis, and a lot of our grant funding is directed towards doing education outreach or earmarked for education outreach. So we do a lot of education at local schools. And so we've worked with the science curriculum coordinators of a couple school districts that we have in town to be able to do classroom presentations for different age levels about this Watershed Protection Plan, about the negative impacts of wildlife feeding. And so we developed several different presentations, one for elementary, one for middle, and one for high school age students, where we can talk about basically just the basics of, what a watershed is, how stormwater runoff, works, how pollutants can end up in the river, and then we kind of focus in on, the bacteria issue, the sources of bacteria, and how, we're trying to manage that bacteria loading to our waterways through, picking up after your pet or not, not feeding wildlife or that type of thing. So we do a lot of these educational presentations. We've reached out to almost 1,000 students with about 10 different presentation days where we've had, rotating classes. So we've reached out to a large number of students. An approach that we talked about during the development of the Watershed Protection Plan was to target our education outreach to students so that they can kind of help inform their parents of, why it's bad to feed wildlife. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking. I understand that the TxDOT campaign with, wearing a seatbelt was kind of done the same way, to where, they did an extensive student or educational campaign directed towards youth so that the youth could learn and then kind of educate their parents. We also do a lot of education outreach at community events. So there's just, a handful of community events each year that are hosted by the city or affiliated with the city. These would be events like Earth Day, a Science Fest that we have, and then Arbor Day Fest. So any opportunity that we have, we basically go out and talk to folks, about what a watershed is. And then we have some informational flyers. We also have the banners that you can see on the slide. It's hard to see the details there, but you can see banners that we developed using grant funds that kind of talk about the Watershed Protection Plan and the negative impacts of wildlife feeding, and then overall what we're doing to manage bacteria loading to Dry Comal Creek and Comal River. We're also right now in the process of working with a local videographer company, a local film company, to develop an educational video around the Watershed Protection Plan. So we're doing this, again, using grant funding through our Watershed Protection Plan grant. We basically, at this point, have a draft of the script and storyboard for that video, and we just went back out to the Watershed Protection Plan stakeholders to get input on that video. So that's where we're at now. We're hoping to have a video completed in the next couple months here. That video will be about 3 minutes long, and then we'll also do shorter snippets that we can use and put into several different platforms. We're looking at putting those in the movie theater, at the previews, also putting those on the city's social media, and also handing that video off to teachers throughout the community so they can show it to their students in the classroom. And that video is going to, again, be focused on a lot of what I've kind of been talking about, but focusing on, negative impacts of feeding wildlife, talk about overabundant wildlife, talk about pet waste management, talking about, again, just the basics of watershed management and how stormwater runoff works and non-point source pollution works. So it'll all have a comical spin on it. We want to create a positive message. We don't want, with any of the education outreach that we're doing, we wanted to make sure that we were presenting solutions and being kind of positive about all these efforts and not painting a doom and gloom of, hey, the water's impaired with bacteria, you don't want to get in there, and that type of thing. So we definitely were careful to not, we don't want to scare away tourism from the town. Overall, the Comal River is still safe to swim. We see bacteria levels that fluctuate. Even though the long-term trends are leveling upwards, a lot of the influence on those levels comes from storm events, where when you have stormwater runoff, you have really high results. During base flow conditions, you get lower results where swimming is still safe. And so in the wash and the averages that they do, you do see those numbers exceeding the state standard. But overall, we just, again, wanted to paint a positive message on this overall effort that we're looking, or that we are moving through on implementing. So that basically covers everything that I have. I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Mark, from start to finish, how long until the city ordinance was passed?
Let's see. So we basically worked with the stakeholders starting in 2014. So it was probably, it was about a 2-year process from the time that we first knew that we wanted to do a wildlife feeding ordinance to when it got adopted. And so during that 2-year period, again, did council workshops, public workshops, and then, again, after a 2-year period, ended up with the wildlife feeding ordinance on the books. One thing that Texas Parks and Wildlife, they had advised, the biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife that we worked with, she had seen other communities that tried to rush into doing either active management or trapping of waterfowl or deer or passing a wildlife feeding ordinance. She had seen communities dive into that very quickly without doing any kind of education outreach and getting buy-in from the community. And she had seen that backfire as folks, maybe didn't understand the reasoning and the facts behind doing an ordinance or moving forward with wildlife management. So we took their advice to heart and made sure that we were doing a lot of education outreach ahead of this ordinance and the waterfowl trapping that we're doing.
And next question is, can you email the feeding ordinance? Could you email it to me and I could distribute it out with the recording of the webinar? Is that possible?
Yeah, that's not a problem. I will send it over to you, Elena, and you can distribute it.
How do you handle residents who prefer to free feed their dogs and cats outside?
Well, I guess we haven't run into those instances where, I would assume that the question is about if folks, put a bowl of dog food in their backyard for their dog to kind of eat throughout the day. I honestly have not had to deal with that instance, but our ordinance is written to where it has to be intentional feeding, of wildlife. So if somebody puts, food out for their dog or cat, and the purpose of that is to feed their pet, then that would be, I guess, allowable under the ordinance.
Do you have an idea of the percentage increase in urban wildlife numbers between 2008 and 2016?
We don't. I guess we have not completed any formal surveys or population studies of wildlife within the city. I guess what Texas Parks and Wildlife will tell you is that you'll look at a stat or a metric called social carrying capacity, and rather than directly doing population counts of wildlife, you will look at the number of auto accidents you're having with deer. You'll look at the bacteria levels in the river, and so as a community you will come up with the social carrying capacity on how many deer auto accidents will you accept as a community before you do something or you take the next step of management. And so we don't have any firm population estimates to say whether there's been an increase or a decrease. We get the question a lot from residents, especially folks who were not supporters of the ordinance, saying, hey, bacteria levels have not gone down. And since we've started implementing this watershed protection plan a year ago, we have not decreases in bacteria levels. And folks will be real quick to point that out, saying, hey, you put this wildlife feeding ordinance in place and the bacteria levels aren't going down, so it's not working. And so one thing we remind folks, and this was also in, with advice from Texas Parks and Wildlife, is it's not it takes time for this to play out. So once you stop feeding wildlife, the populations will naturally disperse out, but it's going to take, 5 or 10 years for that to happen. And so that's something we continually remind folks.
What has been your experience with feral hogs?
We do have in our watershed protection plan, we did include measures associated with feral hogs on doing education, on even doing a bounty program for folks that want to trap and remove feral hogs from their properties. The City of New Braunfels well, not the City of New Braunfels, but the watershed areas that we're working with are largely on the west side of IH-35, more so in the hill country. And so you don't typically see the proliferation of hogs within these watersheds that we're working with as you would on kind of the east side of I-35 and kind of in the Blackland Prairie and the farmlands that are a little further east to us. I am familiar with the Plum Creek Watershed Protection Plan and the Alligator Geronimo Creek Watershed Protection Plans. Those watersheds are more, again, in that Blackland Prairie, more in the prime feral hog populated areas, and those, as part of those watershed protection plans, they are being very aggressive on feral hogs. We included it in our watershed protection plan because we have had reports from ranchers out in the rural parts of the Dry Comal Creek watershed that are starting to see feral hogs, but not to the point where they've been having significant problems or impacts, or even for our effort, to the point where we'd be seeing significant bacteria loading. So we have feral hog management measures in our watershed protection plan, but we are not yet implementing those. We wanted to have a placeholder for that to get funding to manage feral hogs should the populations become more abundant in the future.
How did you go about presenting to City Council? Was it closed doors or a public meeting?
The first time that we presented to City Council was at a City Council workshop that was more of a just city staff, Texas Parks and Wildlife, and City Council. I want to say those workshops were open to the public, but they're not very well advertised like a standard, city council meeting would be. So we did not, or think any public showed up at those council workshops. So basically, that was more of a forum just to let city council ask questions, to present all the information to them. So we did one of those workshops with city council, and then from there, we kind of went more into the public realm of presenting at city council meetings. And I want to say we did a total of 4 city council presentations on this. The first 2 were just talking about the watershed protection plan and the proposed bacteria reduction measures, the wildlife feeding ordinance included. And then the last 2 meetings, we actually did readings of the wildlife feeding ordinance. So a total of 4 city council meetings.
Did you meet any resistance from city council during workshops or presentations? And if so, what was the nature of their concern, and how did you respond?
Sure. From city council, we surprisingly did not get any resistance. City council had some, a lot of questions about kind of, what we were doing and about how the ordinance would be written. And certainly I know city council was hearing from their constituents, on why they felt that the city shouldn't do a wildlife feeding ordinance. But I think for our community, on having all the data, and a lot of the data is kind of what I showed in my earlier slides, on painting the picture of how the river is being monitored, what the bacteria levels are looking at, and then again, that bacteria source tracking data that we had from Texas A&M, council being able to see those results of that BST study, they could clearly see that, okay, I can see that there's bacteria levels that we have a problem, and I can see from the data that's presented here that they're primarily coming from wildlife. So having that information and kind of educating city council, I think helps. And then also, again, with the recreation and the tourism economy that we have, the water-based tourism that we have, and the positive impact on our local economy, they knew that we needed to act on trying to improve the bacteria levels to make sure that recreation is preserved and our rivers and creeks are preserved for recreation. So I think all that together kind of gave city council what they needed to be supportive of the ordinance and the overall effort.
Is slowing down your stormwater runoff part of your plan in addition to the wildlife feeding ordinance?
It is. We do have in the watershed protection plan, implementation of green stormwater infrastructure, LID, whatever you want to call it. Again, management measures to or physical control structures to capture and infiltrate and slow down stormwater runoff. So we do have that in the watershed protection plan. We did not include that in the first round of grant funding, which was for a 3-year period. Reason being is that we wanted to stick to the low-hanging fruit and some of the, I guess, cheaper management measures before kind of moving off and starting to do stormwater treatment facilities and stormwater treatment infrastructure. Certainly, as you start doing design and construction of those types of projects, the cost really increased quickly. So while we didn't apply for those for the first round of grant funding, they are in the watershed protection plan, and we will be looking at doing kind of stormwater treatment infrastructure as we kind of move forward with this watershed protection plan, which really is phased out over a 10-year time horizon.
How do you plan on assessing the effectiveness of the new watershed protection plan?
We're continuing to monitor bacteria. So as part of the Clean Rivers program, our local river authority, the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, they're continuing to go monthly to collect bacteria and water quality samples on the Comal River and Dry Comal Creek. The city also pays for the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority to collect additional samples throughout those stream segments. So we're doing a lot of monitoring. So that is one of our primary kind of metrics, is that water quality data, and looking at that over the next 5 or 10 years, and hopefully we will see decreases in those levels as a result of our implementation effort.
Was there any concern with equine management facilities? And the same question goes for domestic animal facilities like kennels.
That's not something, I guess, that we specifically talked about or that we actually see within the city limits. So, definitely within the city limits, there's no equine or horse facilities. We do have kennels, and honestly, we have not reached out to those kennels to look how they're managing their pet waste, but that's a good idea, something to look into. We also didn't have any, I guess, in the rural areas of the watershed that, on the dry Comal Creek that contributes to the Comal River. Again, no large feeding operation, no large chicken operations or large cattle operations. These are largely kind of smaller homestead ranches. Typically, folks will have, several head of cattle, mainly to get an agricultural, livestock tax exemption. So, no large scale livestock facilities out in the watershed that we were aware of through this kind of watershed characterization project.
Okay, well, Mark, you answered all the questions we received. You made it through.
My contact information is here. Please feel free to give me a call or an email if you have any questions about this presentation or anything that we're doing here at the City of New Braunfels as part of our watershed protection plan or our bacteria reduction effort. Thank you.